Let's add a config file to our mod. Hello everyone, this is Ali Reza. Welcome to the Mentor Code Lab. Before I start talking about config and how we can add our config file to our mod, I should mention that I made few changes in build.gradle. As you see, I commented out the architecture and I commented out the REI's runtime compatibility. The reason is that we will have EMI side by side REI when it comes to add compatibilities. Also, we can make use of EMI as a local runtime version so that when we run the game, we see the EMI. And EMI actually is something like the REI. As you see, it can show the items, the recipes, can have favorites, but there is something that is interesting. You can take a look at the crafting tree and see how you can do the crafting tree. And if you want a JEI compatibility, it can support it. Just add your JEI inside the mods folder. The JEI will be hidden, but the MEI will use JEI for some extra info. Having this, I added some mods related to EMI inside the mods folder. As you see, I added something for enchanting, loot tables, ore distribution, and professions for the villagers. However, this EMI loot is asking to have FZZY config mod, and we will talk about it in a few minutes. And this asks to have language Kotlin mod. So it's just a bunch of mods being added to the mods folder right now inside the runtime. So when I run the client, it's just extra information on top of EMI that I can use as a mod developer every now and then. Let's talk about config files. What are the solutions that we have for config files? Well, of course, the very first solution that we will implement in this video is to write our own config system. This solution will give us flexibility and also control over the structure of the config file that will sit on the run config folder. However, we don't have any graphical representation of that config. If you want to have some graphical representation of your config inside the game, there are other libraries, and today we will take a look at 3 of them. The first one that you may notice we had already added dependency on top, and I will comment it out after this video, is CloudConfig. Now, CloudConfig is developed by Daniel. Don't make a mistake. CloudConfig itself doesn't force you to have this architecture API. If you come and take a look at the Modrinth page for CloudConfig, you don't see architecture being mentioned either in the wiki page or here. And actually, if you run the application and the game right now, remember I commented out the architecture, I rebuilt the Gradle and resynced it. So when I play the client, config files will work and there is no problem there. What is the nice thing about CloudConfig? Well, it has a wiki, and if you come into the wiki page, you see that CloudConfig has 2 different ways of implementing it. The first way is to add your own config screen and adding your own config category, config options, building everything together so that you get your own custom screen for configs. The second way that you are seeing here is the auto config. It's bundled with CloudConfig, so you don't need to add anything extra or set up anything inside your project. Just using some annotations, as you see, you will add your own entries in the config. For example, here he is adding the config for the mod ID, then he is adding an entry and then another entry. This is a class, as you see, an inner class that will become category with 2 integer in it. And this one is excluded, as you see, from the GUI. And this one is collapsible, so you can collapse it like this minus here. So this is an inner class with some fields and it's collapsible and stuff like that. You can read through this wiki page and learn how to use CloudConfig. The other option that we have is yet another config lib. Now you may think to yourself, if CloudConfig is good enough, why do we have YACL? YACL talks about CloudConfig API. Basically, developers of Cloud has clarified that they are likely not going to add any more features. They don't want to touch it. And in his opinion, this is a bad thing. Honestly, I can't agree with him, because when you have something that is working and when you have covered every feature that you want, then you will not touch it. Think about your own mod. You have some features in mind as a mod developer that you want to have in the game. The moment you have finished finished adding them and made sure that everything is working, there is a chance that you will not touch your mod other than upgrading it and just making it compatible with the new versions of the game. So this is not a bad thing in my opinion. At some point, even YACL will become feature rich, and at that point the developer will not touch its code unless it's necessary for upgrading. However, if you want to work with YACL, again, we have a wiki page for YACL and you can take a look. Now this is, as you see, very close to CloudConfig. A little bit different, but the whole structure is the same. Problem is that you don't have the glory of using annotations. You have to use code in this way that he is showing you to add your own groups, categories, and controls and options and everything. So you don't have that glory of autoconfig using YACL. Now people think that YACL is better than CloudConfig because they think that for CloudConfig they need architecture. That's not correct. For CloudConfig you don't need architecture. Now there is something here that I want to show you, and that is this. When should I use this, meaning YACL or CloudConfig or any other library that is showing you something like this config screen? It clearly says that it is designed with client mods in mind. If you want a quick produce GUI feature to set the config values, then yes, these libraries are for you. The last one that I want to show you is that FZZY config. Again, this is a config that will let you have configure screens inside the game. Of course, the looks may differ, but the structure and behavior is the same. You can have GUI and configurations inside GUI. And also, he is providing a wiki page so that you can go on and read it, and he supports both Kotlin and Java in examples. Now, this time, if you look, you just extend a class, and every variable that you set here will become a config in the GUI. You just need to register it like any other registry in the game, and that's it. Just polish the view and everything else. Okay? However, this one has a problem in my eyes, and that is that you need to install another mod as the player to get this thing working. In other words, if I'm a player and I want to play UIO alone without any other mods, maybe with few client-side mods that would make things easier for a player, but I don't want to add any mod that adds blocks, items, or touches the mechanics of the game. Now, if I want to use FZZY, I have to add this language Kotlin. Remember, UIO doesn't need this because we are not programming in Kotlin. So why should I have to add this one as a mod dependency? I don't like it myself as a player. As a programmer, the decision is up to you. That's a valid situation. That's a valid solution. You can use it. Now, the thing is that when you are registering the FZZY, he says that you can make it in 3 ways. One for both client and server, one for client only, and one server side only. I didn't see it in YACL, so keep that in mind. CloudConfig doesn't talk about this, but I think CloudConfig covers both sides. I'm not sure about that. Now, all of these solutions aside, normally when you want a config in a mod is to set some values for the mod to be used on every world out there. Of course, we can have per world config files, but in our case, that's not the thing. If you want to do that, you can use this same system, but you need to tweak it. You need to save the file in a separate folder under the word, read it per word, and stuff like that. However, normally, when you use config, is to set some constant fields that will be used by your mod for every word of that gameplay. So the player has to set the config once, and every word that he creates and plays will carry these settings into itself. Also, many mods don't provide a GUI for setting the configs. Configs will be only one file sitting under the configs folder under run. Some of them use JSON, some of them use TOML, some of them use INI or INI, and all of them are okay. The looks are just different. Personally, I don't like JSON because for JSON we can't add comments. Tamil, well, yes, in Tamil you can add it, but honestly, if we want to use Tamil, why not use any? INI files are easier to handle, are easier to write, and easier to read. We will start with a system that is already being developed. We will tweak it and use it to make things easier for ourselves. Now, to add our own config system, there is a class that was written by someone called simple config system. And simple config, the link is in the main file as a comment, is this. If I move to the root, you will notice that the developer is telling you to add a simple config.av with a provider and then request the config. And this is the provider, and this is how you can set default values or get default values if there is nothing provided. Let's just copy this whole thing, and you will see that I will start changing this little by little as we go forward, because in my opinion, this is a good solution, but not a robust solution, and I want to expand upon it. We will come into the util package, make a new package, and we will call it config. The reason I'm making it under util package is that later when we learn how to use library system, we will separate parts of this util package and make our own library that our projects can depend upon it. Library that is inside repository for GitHub called its class simple config. However, being under config package, I will make a little difference here and I will call it base config. And I will start importing things part by part from the GitHub repository and make changes here and there. If you notice, the very first thing is this logger. We don't need a logger. Also, we have this config request. We don't have it yet. In the repository, as you see, it has this interface sitting inside this class. And also, it has an internal class. I don't like it because I think if we want to make something like a library, things should be modular enough. So I will take this interface out of here and I will add a Java class. It's an interface called default config. I don't want to deal with different naming things here and there. We have this default config interface, and then we have this config request class. I will add a new Java class, call it config request, has 3 private fields, that is private final file, and file comes from java.io, and a string, of course, and default config, that is our interface. And this is a new way of using interfaces. So far in my video series in the channel, we are not implementing an interface, but we are accepting a field that is implementing that interface. Then we have the constructor. Of course, the constructor needs to have the file and file name, assigns empty as the field for the provider or the default config. The next part is a provider. Now, provider returns the same config request as the provider. However, it assigns the default provider at the same time. Basically, here we are chaining things. The last part of this config request from the GitHub repository is this simple config and get config. Now, simple config is this base config. Okay, I need to change it to base config. And because we didn't implement the base config right now, you don't understand what is going on here. But basically, we are calling the constructor. We are presenting ourselves as the config request system, and we are returning that base config. So basically, we can say config request, and it will handle everything. Get config, of course, it adds the provider .get the file name with a plus \n. \n means that you go on the new line in the string. As you can see, the documentation is nice. It says loads the config from the file system. This one sets the default config provider used to generate the config if it's missing. For time being, we have to import everything so that we understand what is going on. The problem is that our constructor was private because it was an internal class. Now it becomes the public one. This one creates the config. So let's read it. It requests a file and makes a directory if it needs the directory. Then it checks and creates the file, and then it prints the request config and closes the file. So basically, this is creating the config file for us, and it's private helper method. The next one is the load config, and it's again a private one. So the scanner comes from Java util. We have a problem with this file because if you notice, the file is private and we don't get access to this file like this. But as I said, I will come back and fix things here and there because right now we will have problems because we separated the config request from the main class and made a separate class. So the encapsulation is junk right now. The next method is actually responsible of reading that config file line by line. If you notice, accepts a line number and checks if the line starts with hashtag. If it starts with hashtag, then it means that it's a comment, so it will ignore it. But if it's not starting with hashtag and the line is not empty, then we know that we are reading some config value and it will parse that line, separate it based on the equal sign, and then it puts a config parts together inside something. And this config, if you notice, is a hash map. So basically we are keeping the configs in memory after the first read so that we don't have to read the config over and over time and time again. We will come back and tweak this one a little bit in future, but let's just implement what we have to for time being. You notice that it says simple config. It's not simple config anymore. It's base config and it asks for the config request. This is our constructor. And now the error here should be gone. Of course, it's yelling at us because it was private. It should become public. And then this error is gone. Let's take a look at here. Config request.file name. Of course, the file name is again private and we don't have any accessor for it. And instead of this, we call log n and we are using the reference logger. Now this one is log error. Now we can use the logger from reference here because we are logging error here and that's okay. And E is the exception. So I can get the message from the exception and that's it. Now these few lines are trying to create the config as you see. And if it is not successful and we got an exception, then of course we are catching the exception, showing everything and then flagging that boolean for broken to true so that we know that we can't catch the config in future and try to read it. Now, if we are not broken after creating the config, we are trying to load the config. And again, if there is an exception, we are catching the exception and we will show the message from the exception and we will reflag the broken to true. But if we are not broken in creation and we are successful in loading the config, then that's it. Basically, we are golden and the config is in memory right now. After that, I will assign the rest of the things. Basically, just need to make sure that instead of simple config, we have base config. This is designing API, and whenever you are designing API, you may go back and forth and try to add and remove stuff. That's completely natural. Now we have two problems all over this place. If you notice, file name and file. Other errors are again file, 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 and get config. What is wrong with get config? Let's take a look. Get config is private, make it public. That one was simple. Again, the file and file name. We need to encapsulate this file and file name into some get methods, and the setter is not really needed because we are setting them and they are final in the constructor. So we just need to have two encapsulations for getting these. So we say public file, get file, return this.file, public string, get file name, return this.file name. Okay, now coming back here, whenever I see file name, I will say get file name. Whenever I see file, I can say get file. And basically now we have done everything and base config and config request is ready to be used. Now, one thing is that at some point, Cop and Joe had tweaked this file. Honestly, what he had done is not a big deal, but it's something that is nice to have. So I will comment this parse config, indicating that it was modified by Cop and Joe. This config system is designed in such a way that if I start a line with a hashtag, it will be a comment. Other than that, it will try to parse this. The key equals the value. There is no space here. That's one thing that you should notice, because if you come back to the parse method, you see that it's trying to split on equal. However, what Cop and Joe is doing is that he is letting us having a space and a hashtag. This is a line comment. We can add our own comment. Then he will add this, a pipe, and at the end of the pipe, he will type default colon, for example, some number. And this way, not only he is letting us having our own comment, but also he is defining that the default value is something that the user may need to know when he wants to reset the values. This is nice to have. So I will tweak it first with the tweaks that Cop and Joe had done, and then we will sit back and think about the lack of a space here. So what Cop and Joe is doing is that here, after checking that if it starts with hashtag or not, then it splits with the equal with the limitation of 2. And if you notice, the limit controls the number of times the pattern is applied and therefore affects the length of the resulting array. Okay, now after this check, here's the thing that is changed. Before this config.put, he says string temp equals to parts1, because this is the section after this equal that contains our comment maybe, and it says dot split again using space hashtag, and he gets the element 0. Now this means that if we have this space hashtag, the split will return an array of 2, and we are getting the first one that is the section before this hashtag. And if there is nothing like this, the split will return the whole thing, and we are again getting it back. And finally, instead of this parts1 is returning 10. Okay, so instead of making it so that people think that the whole method was changed, I will put this comment at the end of the 2 lines. Here is something. If I want to use space, what can I do? Let's put a comment here. What I will have is like this: key space equals to value and space default 46. Okay. Now, this section is something that the system, our API, will totally ignore. So it doesn't matter if it has the space or if it doesn't have the space. The main thing is these 2 spaces around the equal. Now, if I change the thing to this, key equals value, hashtag, comment, pipe, default, colon, 46, without any spaces. All I need to change is that I will say replace, and if you can see, I can replace the old char with the new char. I want to replace this space with nothing, and I can chain the command. We got our entry, we removed every space from the entry, and then we split on the equal. So we have element 0 as the parts. Here would become the key. Part 1 would become this value, hashtag, comment, pipe, default, colon, 46. So now we don't have any space to use here, and I will remove that space, and that's it. So I will put my name at the end, and I will make this comment here so that people know that I changed this part of the code. Also, I will take this from here and I will move it on top of the class, making a Java doc, and I will put it there. That was the change that Cop and Joe had done, and I had implemented my own on top of it. And by doing this, the base config system is finished. However, if you recall, the main documentation was talking about a provider. So we need to add a provider. And honestly, Cop and Joe had done a nice work of it. However, I want to add one little extra thing on top. Now, inside the config package, I will add a config provider, and it implements our default config. Now we need to implement methods, and that method is get. Before that, we want to have a private string config content. Now remember, this is the content of the whole config file. So we are reading everything and putting it inside the string. And then we say public list and list of a pair. This may look confusing at the first glance. What we are doing here is that we are making a list of our config key value pairs. So remember, each config has a key and a value inside our hash map. We are making a list out of it. And we say get configure, or actually get config list. Why not? And here we are returning the configs list. Now, what is configs list? As you can guess, it's a list of pair, private list of pair, and I will call it final, and we call it configs list. From here on, I'm tweaking the code provided from Cop and Joe, and I will make a constructor that has nothing in it. So I will remove this config list, and instead of assigning it to something from past, I will say it's new array list. Now, we have a little bit of problem with this pair. The class that we want, Mojang data fixers util, and that is the pair that we want, so that now everything is working and not yelling at us. Right now, we have a list, we have a string, we have the constructor, we have a get method to get the list, and now we want the content. Of course, it is simply returning this dot config content, but we need one extra method because the provider is responsible of creating the config file with default values and then keeping them in the memory and returning back to the whole system. So we will say public void add pair, and here we want to have a pair of course, a string and any type. This is a wildcard in generics. If you don't know what are generics, I'm in the process of recording them, or I had already recorded and uploaded them. It depends on when you are watching the video. So go on. There is this big list of videos all about generics for Java that is available in the channel. We call it pair, why not? And then a string, we call it comment. This is one thing that is provided by Copenjo. By the way, I need to comment this class, and let's add the Java doc, not modified by, but provided. So provided by Copenjo, but also at the same time, it's being modified by me. And by the way, this is my name inside the game. And if you can't read it, it's Jiraiya from an anime, Naruto, if you know. So add pair. What Copenjo is doing here is saying config list.add the pair. After that, we are saying config content equals to, and I will copy paste it from the repository provided by Copenjo, but we had changed the names. So this is the pair first. First is the key. Then we add the equal. Of course, I want spaces here. And then this is the value plus, now this is data space hashtag, the comment. The default value is the pair that gets second and a new line. So we are just adding these pair values one after another in separate lines into this string. And at the end, we are returning this string. However, that's all Copenjo had written. I want to add something, and I will call it add comment, because if you recall, the base system would let you have comments at the start of the line. Now for the comments, we are not adding anything to our pair list. However, we are adding it into our configs, and the thing that we want to add into the string of the config is just hashtag and then the comment with a new line. And that's adding a comment. It just adds the comment on the string and nothing to the pair, and that's it. Okay, now we have our library for the config. Where to add our mod config file and how can we use that? Of course, I could put it inside the registry, but it's not a registry thing because registries are just registered into the game. It's not a data gen thing. So I will put it at the root of the project and I will call it configs. Now configs is a simple class. However, we have public static base config and we call it config with capital letters. Then we have a private static config provider and we call it provider. And of course, I didn't have a constructor yet. I will start adding things that I want to have as config. Let's take a look. We want a radius on the command. This is the integer. So I will call public static int and I will call it DCLR radius. Then we have this effect duration. If we take a look, we are talking about the duration. This is again an integer. Citrine copper, yeah, we will keep them separated and we will call this integer citrine sword duration. I will duplicate this one and this one is copper. What else do we have? Excavator and hammer. These are max distances, basically this distance value that we are looking into. Again, those are integers. Then we have the sapphire sword. Now sapphire sword has two different things. One is the effect duration and then we have pushback multiplier values. Both are the same thing, but for the multiplier I may want to use float. Oh, it accepts doubles, so I will accept double. The duration is integer. Okay, this one is double sapphire sword multiplier. Remember, the names that I'm giving here are not the same thing that will be added to the config file. Now that we have these, we want to have a method, and this is one thing that I changed from what I had seen, and I will call it public static void. Now I can use init, but I will use load. Inside the load, we say provider equals to new config provider. Now that we have the config provider, we will call a private method. We say create config. The config static that we have equals to base config dot of. If you notice, we need a file name first. So we say our mod ID from the reference plus, and here I will use a name underline config. Then here we say dot provider, and this is our provider. And you remember I said we are chaining commands. So here we are turning back that base config. So we can say .request. Now that we have the config, we can say assign config values. Now we need to create these two private methods. Private static void create configs. For creating the configs, we need to give these entries into the config. I can say provider dot add a comment. Now the comment that I want to add is related to DCLR radius. The radius for DCLR command, this will be the value for the command to expand on each side. If you want, by the way, you can't use \n like so, but you can add another comment. Why not? The final dimension would be radius multiplied 2, and that's it. Now that we have these two comments, we can say provider dot add pair. Now after adding the pair, we want a new pair. This pair needs a key and a value. So the value here, if we notice, is this guy 128 that I had assigned between the videos, and that's it. So that's the value. However, the string here, by the way, we need to add something else, and if you look, it says the comment, and I want to add this. So I will copy this, I will paste it, I will remove this comment. All I'm doing is that I will remove this comment section. So now I can add something without a comment because I had added the comment on top, so I don't need another comment at the end. And by the way, I don't need this pipe now, just the default. So the key here would be, I don't know, DCLR radius or DCLR dot radius. It can be anything, but it shouldn't have equal sign. Don't forget that, or hashtag. Okay, now that we have this one, we can continue forward and adding these, but let's first get rid of this error because we had one example and we will add other examples at the end, but I need to finish this whole thing first. So private static void assign config values, and here I will say DCLR radius equals to config.get or default. The thing that we want is this key. We want a default value of 128. We have keys, we can add them here. So public static class config and public static final string DCLR equals to that. And now I can come back to configs, and instead of using this, I will say keys.dclr. We should say config. Yeah, now it's finding it. DCLR. Here I will say reference.keys.config.dclr. Now I can say that import to static Jiraiya UI or reference.star, and this means that now I can directly assign keys.config.dclr. And this way I don't have to be cautious about typos between the assignment and creation. And finally, at the end, we can say log n all plus provider dot get config list dot size, because remember it's a list anyway, not set, size plus have been set properly. But I shouldn't say set. I will get it from here. I will add it here, and here I should say loaded properly. That's the CLR comment. Now how can we use it? I will remove this constant from here, and of course I will have few errors down here. Instead of this, I can say configs from jiraiya.uio dot DCLR radius, and now I can have that value and use it wherever I want, however I want. If you want to use configs in such a way that your OR generator would read configs and then generate something, you have to write your own OR generator for the game, and I really don't suggest that. So if you want to disable something these days, you have to make a data pack for yourself and put JSON files in data pack related to the mod that you want to disable the OR generation and do things in the JSON. You remember that we are creating the config files and assigning the values inside this load method. So inside the main, right on top, after logging the main, we should say configs.load. And I will do it before any type of registry, because when I'm registering things like mod items, I may want to read values from this config system. I have to make sure that the configs are being loaded before anything else in my main initialization, so that I have an easy mind remembering that, okay, I can access anything from the config if I need to. Let's run the client and take a look at that config folder. Remember, the moment I see this log for the main in the log section of the client running, I should be able to see my config here, not before that. And there we go. And here we go. uio.config.txt properties. Now, if I open it inside here, maybe, please, somewhere, not possible. Okay, let's use Notepad++ and let's take a look at that config file. So as you see, this is my config. What is that null here? What is that null? That is bothering me. What is this null here? It shouldn't be. Basically, this is the first entry, and from there on, we are okay. We have 2 empty lines at the end. We shouldn't have that, but it doesn't matter because we checked if we are not empty lines. And then this will be a comment. This is our key, our value, and no comments. So we see default equals to that. I will run the game one last time so that you see what is happening. I will stop the game, and now let's open this. And what you get is this. You will get the comment, then you will get a new comment. The default value is 128. That class.simpleName section shows this integer, and this time it's double. So now we added an extra line of comment. Even if we don't give in any comment to the system, the user will have these two. And I think this is a much nicer approach to showing the default value and the type and any comments that we want to add on top. This library now became so flexible that whatever you want to do, you can do that. You can add a simple line of comment. You can add a pair and comment, and actually you will get the default values and the type of the value on the top. In future, when we learn about library system, we will come back and take out this whole config section into our own separate library, and we will depend our project into that library, just like what we had and commented somewhere here for fluid handling. We will learn how to do this from GitHub. As you see, it's GitHub repository and it's mine. So we can simply learn how to do this, and we will use this system to add our own configs into the library and make a library that always make this config system available for us. All we have to do is that we need to make this configs class, and of course it will be part of the temp mod development.
If you like these videos, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button and turn on that bell so that when I publish a new video, you will get informed. Have fun everyone. Bye.